Right, hello everybody. Welcome
Right.
to the online question and answer session. We've got Chris here with us at the National STEM Learning Centre. Unfortunately, Dylan is out travelling, so he's not able to join us live in the room. However, he has kindly recorded responses to a variety of different questions that you've posed, so thank you very much for those. And they will be intercut throughout the question and answers that Chris and I are doing, so that you will get to see the answers and his thoughts and reflections. This is the Assessment for Learning in STEM Teaching online course hosted by FutureLearn, and we are currently in week 4. So thank you very much everybody, and thank you Chris, off we go. Right, moving on to a question from Matthew Jones, who is asking about questioning and discussing. His question is, how do you remember everything the pupils say as you question? Which is a really good question.
You don't. I think is the answer, Matthew. I think, again, you need to think about what Assessment for Learning is doing. And Assessment for Learning is finding out through activities and questions, what do children know, what do they partly know, and what don't they know. And it's the partly knows you want to go for. So I think if I was doing it in the classroom, and again, I've seen teachers doing this, I'd be noting down the bits that I need to deal with later in the lesson or next lesson. That's the important bit. So it's not recording everything a child doesn't know. It's the part he knows that you can work with that you need to record.
That's brilliant, thank you Chris. Which is something that Matthew said about, do you focus on 2 or 3 pupils, and you're saying it's the key things that come out that link to maybe those students.
Yeah, and if your kids are working in groups, then it's not just 2 or 3 pupils, it's 2 or 3 groups. So you can get, quite a big feedback. Otherwise, for some teachers, they just feel that they never get around the whole class. But if you've got your kids working well collaboratively and using one another as a resource, then it's much better to do it that way.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Paul Martin has submitted a question that asks about any ideas on making hinge questions that have a minimal effect on students with low self-esteem would be very welcome. A few people have asked about self-esteem and the questioning culture.
Yeah, well, I think with Hingepoint questions, they are really a tool for teachers to slip in the odd question here and there at those key points when you want to find out whether it's now the opportunity to move on, or do I need to do some remediation of some sort. So you don't need a lot of these. So I think the odd question just here and now won't affect children's self-esteem too much. It's different from getting a low mark in a, say, a 20-mark quiz or a 100-mark examination paper. But the other way is how you handle it. If you say to the children, look, I'm going to put this question now because I just want to check where different people are to know where we're going to go next in the learning. The children know then that there's a reason for asking that. It's not that I want to try and catch you out. It's that I actually want to really find out where you're at and whether I need to do some more work with you. So I think if you sort of are honest with the children and explain why you're doing things, it doesn't affect their self-esteem. I know one thing that Dylan does, and this is maybe more in the maths arena than possibly in the science classroom, although there may be some science teachers that can get this to work, and that is to have multiple answers that are correct within your multiple choice. Mm-hmm. So there might be 5 answers, so A through to E, but maybe 3 of those are correct, or 2 of those are correct. And so if you make one of those a really simple one, then all kids get that. So all kids feel they've achieved something in that answer. And then, next time they might look more closely to see whether there's a second or a third answer. And I know he uses that quite a lot within a maths context.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. That's some great advice there, Paul. Thank you, Chris, for that. Moving on to a question from Cheryl, apologies if I pronounce things wrong, Townsend. Mm-hmm. She works with post-16 learners, which is, a particular group.
Yep.
And she's talking about how we get the group to participate. Any support or activities that you can suggest for group participation for post-16, she would really appreciate.
Well, post-16 are usually quite focused on sort of getting ready for exams, even though we want them to sort of do a lot of learning. If they're in the UK, they've just done exams at age 16, and in the past few years, they've had to have exams at 17 and 18. So it's very exam-orientated. So sometimes get them to work on model answers together, maybe just to rank 3 or 4 model answers. It might not necessarily be a whole essay, it could just be to, say, a short answer part, maybe a 6-mark question. And then to think about, if you've got them in advance to answer that question, think about where their answer would go in that ranking. That sort of thing helps them to start looking at what's a good piece of work. And when they get to doing what's a good piece of work and talking about that, they start talking about learning and working better collaboratively. So all those other sorts of bits of assessment for learning, which we've not really dealt with in the MOOC, can actually help here. The other thing is to get them to start coming up with questions. I mean, explain either Bloom's taxonomy or SOLO or whatever you use. Maybe use our question stems that we've been using in the STEM videos to get the kids to come up with good questions when they've read a bit of the text for homework. And then that can be part of the discussion in the lesson with the teacher just refereeing and developing the answers even further.
Lovely. I hope that helps, Cheryl. It'd be good to know if you do try any of these out, how you got on, and feedback to us on the MOOC, please, if you get the chance before the end of the course. It'd be interesting for us and others to see. Moving on now to a question from Paul Thomas. He's asking about the importance of the terminology for students. He says he can ask a question one way and most of the class get it correct, but if he tweaks the phrasing even a little, many will get confused. So he's looking at assessing the same idea different ways and looking for common stumbling blocks. What are your thoughts about the terminology and the developing of these questions, Chris?
It depends what the stumbling block is, I think, really. I mean, if the stumbling block is a sort of literacy thing, then you're assessing their literacy rather than you're assessing their conceptual understanding. So it's a bit hard without knowing precisely what you're talking about. But I mean, Mesick, when he's talking about, when you're looking at the validity of a question, he talks a lot about irrelevance, that sometimes we put things in that actually prevent students displaying the performance that they've actually got. And sometimes language is a very important part of that. So if I was you, I'd maybe record you working with the kids and doing that and seeing what are the things that are actually holding them up. Or, selecting a range of students and doing a little study yourself on what's helping and what's not helping them to actually access questions. And then if the questions that they've eventually got to answer in their exams are more complex than that, thinking about how you train them towards that. And there's lots of good stuff if you go back to national strategy stuff on how you develop the type of language, type of literacy that's there. Certainly in the new national curriculum in England, both numeracy and literacy are more important within the science curriculum than previously. So we do need to pay attention to that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And just to let you know, as Chris mentioned there, Paul, the national strategy materials, a lot of those are available on the National STEM Learning Centre. So if you go online and register, you'll be able to look through and find some of those materials to support you with that. Thank you, Chris. So I've got a question here from Ian Valance, who is talking about maths, particularly the new maths GCSE programme, about this idea that you don't move on until everyone in the class has grasped the current content, the current topic. For those who have grasped it, the idea is to give them materials which take their learning wider rather than further. I suppose there's a lot of talk at the minute in the UK, particularly about mastery, which I think this links to. And then Ian's question is this people's understanding about taking that learning wider? And if so, is there anywhere where we can find these new thinking wider materials? How could we?
Right. If I just deal generally with it first, and then I'll try to think about materials, because maths is not my specialism. It's more Dylan's, but I have got a project where I'm working with maths teachers, and I'll try and remember some of the things they've told me is good places to look. Mastery. I think mastery is something that we should try for all of our students, but there's mastery in terms of thinking about, are they secure in that concept, or have they got a sort of at least a gem of the understanding of that concept, and a sort of differentiating between those two and deciding between those two is worth talking about with your colleagues in school as to what that would look like in maths. One of the things that I constantly challenge my maths colleagues to do is to ask me a question that would actually test whether I could do Pythagoras or I could do trigonometry. What's that one question, or those 2 or 3 questions? Because I don't need to do 20 questions in order to test that. That's just more practice of using particular ideas in maths. But what's the 1 or 2 or 3 questions? They're going to be really important questions for you that will help you both form, the sorts of questions and the sorts of activities you'll need for your intentional dialogue or for forming Hingepoint questions. I'm trying to remember the website that my teachers use a lot. I've got an inquiry learning project in mathematics that I'm doing. And they do a lot of work on problem solving, and there's one particular website which probably everybody who's a maths teacher is now shouting at the screen saying it's this, but I can't remember what it is for the moment.
Is it?
Enrich, thank you. Well done. No, it's Enrich, and there's some really good activities on there that you can engage the kids in, and it really then does get them to apply ideas. I mean, not only problem solving ideas, but some of the conceptual understanding that they've picked up in other parts of mathematics. And that might be useful. One of the things that both the science and the maths curriculum are trying to do, which I think is actually one of the good things with our new curriculum, and that is to actually connect things more. So rather than just learn things in isolation, it's about connectedness, which is a much higher order thinking thing to do. So again, getting kids to relate. I mean, I remember when my own daughter was doing maths at school, she hadn't got any clue that fractions got anything to do with percentages, etc. She just learnt everything separately. And then all of a sudden it twigged that that they were linked, and she started understanding much easier and gaining confidence. So, it does help students if we can help them connect as well as to actually get one particular bit of mathematics sorted out.
Brilliant, that's really helpful. I hope that you find that useful. So there were some ideas for materials there, but also the bigger picture about that connectiveness. And I can echo with Chris that my two children learning maths.
And yours have recently done their GCSEs, haven't they?
Mine found it really difficult last year answering some GCSE questions because they couldn't link ideas. They just learnt, and didn't have that deeper understanding, that connectedness. So the new context came along and it just flawed them. So Chris is right. Thank you very much. Moving on to Ewelina's Munda. A question here about how do you ensure young learners, I suppose this will apply to, I think, lots of learners, do not copy one another's answers when we're using questioning, particularly, I suppose, if we're looking at whole response classroom types of questioning. So how do we ensure that doesn't happen, Chris?
Well, I think you're probably talking about responding to Hingepoint questions. I mean, one is to make sure they know that if they are honest with their answers, then they'll get help. So it's no good trying to get the question right and then later on be penalised because you really haven't got it. So, if you do maybe questions early on and then say, okay, so all those who answered C, come here because I'm going to help you. All those who answered A and B, go to those tables. You've got some worksheets to do. They pretty soon pick up that they are going to get help if they don't know it. So those sorts of things help. I mean, I think the other thing, I know some teachers like to use finger answering rather than cards or whiteboards, and then it makes it much harder to answer because if the child's either got their hand on their shoulder like this and saying, it's C, or up here and saying it's C or it's B or whatever, so one finger for A, two fingers for B and so on, then it's much harder for them to actually copy off one another. So some teachers use things like that, but eventually you want the students to realise that they get benefit from answering the question they truly believe is the right answer, and if it's wrong, then the teacher will help them out or they'll get some sort of help in sorting it out. It just changes the way they look at things. I'm in school to be helped, to learn things, not I'm in school to get things right.
Yeah, which is all about that classroom culture that's coming,
Absolutely.
it's coming through strongly, I think, in lots of the answers that we're getting from Chris about how we establish this culture to get learners seeing that actually us finding out what they're thinking is crucial.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ewelina. So, moving on to Mark Coleman. He is struggling with the distinctions between assessment for and assessment as an assessment of learning. It seems to him that Hingepoint questions could fit into any of these categories. Is it the purpose that makes the AFL items?
Okay, I mean, the for, of, and as, there's a historical context to this, which I'll go through quickly.
Be good.
Originally, we had formative assessment. When Paul Black and Dylan Wiliam wrote Inside the Black Box in 1998, we called it formative assessment. But the assessment reform group brought in the terms assessment for learning to distinguish it from exams and tests, which is assessment of learning mainly, although you can use tests formatively. So that was around for quite a while. We've done a lot recently on Dylan and myself and Paul Black and others, where we talk about classroom assessment and classroom assessment for formative purposes. That's assessment of learning, assessment for learning, sorry. Formative assessment is assessment for learning, and then assessment, classroom assessment that's for summative purposes, that's assessment of learning. The as comes in from the Scottish take on this. So our northern colleagues, led mainly by people like Louise Haywood, who's written a lot in this area, and others, have talked about assessment as learning. And what they're trying to say with that is this idea that assessment's taking place as learning's taking place, which I agree with. But I don't like this one of assessment as learning, because I think it just takes the focus off what the purposes are. It just makes it sound as though assessment is everything, and it's not. It's purposeful. So that's just a bit about how this all came about. Where do Hingepoint questions go? Definitely in assessment for learning, because that's why you're asking Hingepoint questions. That's the purpose of it. If you want to ask test questions, use test questions that are from the summative type things they're going to do later, as long as they are near that particular point when they're being assessed. So if they've got GCSEs, or if you're in Scotland, if you've got standard or higher coming up, use some of those questions that are there, and keep the Hingepoint questions for the formative. Or if you want to use diagnostic questions, then go and look at some of the questions that Robin Miller and Mary Whitehouse have developed on the York project. Because they can be quite useful as well. But it's thinking about getting the right type of questions for the purpose you want, not just any question will do, and I'll work out afterwards how to use it. One of the things I think we've learnt with assessment over the last couple of decades is we need to be purposeful, and not just that it's a catch-all. As long as I've got an answer, we'll do something with it. All right. Hope that's helpful and not too confusing.
I think that was really helpful, Chris. One thing I'm going to share, because Chris and I have talked about this before, and Mark, and I think lots of people discuss it too. Chris once said to me that assessment for learning, a phrase that you thought was really useful, was responsive teaching.
Yeah.
And I think that, for me, sums it up really nicely. It's the fact that we use assessment and then it has an impact and we do something with it, that responsiveness. And it's just a phrase that I think brings clarity to a lot of teachers I work with.
Yeah.
In terms of assessment for learning, is this responsive teaching.
Yeah, I've just written an article on that. It's not been accepted yet, but hopefully it will get accepted by a journal. And it is responsive teaching, not reactive teaching. All right, so it's thoughtful responses of teachers to what children are saying and doing in their learning.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Right, moving on to a question from John Wood, which is an interesting question, John. Thank you very much. One of the things he'd like to know is about how we're using assessment for learning in the course. He says it would be ironic if we weren't, which I think is a really interesting point, because we did think about that, John, as we set the course up. He has asked about the fact that we've provided discussions that highlight their misconceptions, and that we've made them take quizzes. He asked whether or not the next 3 weeks will be modified in any way as a result of what the participants on the course are doing.
No. But can I say, when we set up the course that last year, with the help of particularly Seb Schmoller, who really sort of advised in doing this, I had a complete, almost nervous breakdown in terms of setting up this course, because I hadn't realised what a control freak I was, in that usually when I'm working with teachers, I do practice assessment for learning as well as I possibly can, in that I'm forever changing things. I never let teachers have my PowerPoints until the end of a session, because I'm constantly, as they are working on things and responding in different ways, changing my PowerPoint during a session. You can't do that on a MOOC. So what we had to do was to make many of the activities and as open as they possibly could be, so that people looking at them from their own particular understanding would translate them in one way or another, and then to think about the possibilities they might come up with, and then design the next activity so that it could respond to that. So some of the quizzes we've put in are for doing that, for picking up on things where we feel teachers may find some things difficult, or where they might have gone astray and be thinking of something else by what a previous activity has led them to. And one of the things that's really helped us with that as we're going through, and maybe has helped us sort of produce another layer that allows us to be more formative, are the discussion boards. And I know that Andrea spends a lot of time, and Paul Browning, who works on the project, looking regularly at what people are writing as they are trying out some of the activities. And then they alert myself and Dylan to those when they feel, well, either they respond because they both are themselves very experienced in terms of assessment for learning, or they ask us to respond. So I mean, I spend, when Andrew or Paul send me an email, I usually spend about an hour or so, not just looking at what those few people that they've alerted me to have written, but going back through what other people have written. So it gives me some sort of idea. We are thinking of doing other MOOCs leading on from assessment for learning, and what's in this first one will help us in that second one. So we are getting medium and long-term formative assessment in, and a little bit of short-term. But we're relying on you out there to respond to things on the discussion boards, because you actually will, by what you're actually encouraging other colleagues to think and write about, be influencing their learning and giving them formative feedback by the responses that are there. Either they'll read what you said and think, no, that's rubbish, I'm right, or they'll read what you said and think, oh no, maybe there's something in that, and they'll respond in various ways. So there are some things that are there. It's very different to face-to-face. It's very different to how I'd work in a classroom, or how I'd work if I was actually running a course for teachers. I don't know, because you run quite a lot of courses, Andrea. Do you feel the same?
Yeah, absolutely. That with the face-to-face courses, it's very much about, as we've talked about, identifying where people are, what their needs are, responding then so that the CPD, the continuing professional development, meets their needs, and tailoring that. And as Chris has said, the formative part of this online course is by looking at the discussions and threads. And then we can respond, and so if anybody wants to raise a question or has ideas or wants further strategies, we can respond and give you some research literature to go away and read and think about, or we can point you in the direction of somebody else on the course who's responded, and we can start linking you up and getting that connectiveness going across people's responses. So we are being formative and responding to your need through the discussion threads. So as Chris says, they're a really powerful place for you to think about and reflect and share your learning with each other.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Chris. So Shrija Kumari has asked a question here, which is a really interesting question. It's about our understanding. She's asking about our understanding about intentional dialogue and Hingepoint questions and misconceptions. So if I try and paraphrase this correctly, she says, am I correct in understanding that an intentional dialogue stimuli is a question that is open-ended and draws in a lot of misconceptions? So that's the first thing. And then, does a Hingepoint question come after these misconceptions are clarified through work in the class, whatever that might be? What do you mean?
Yeah, Hingepoint questions come later. So the intentional dialogue would probably come earlier in the learning cycle, so that the ideas the students have got that maybe are alternative conceptions or misconceptions are aired, and you do some work on trying to rectify or to at least present evidence that will challenge those misconceptions. That's not to say the misconceptions go away with all kids, but you try and do something about it. And then, the Hingepoint questions come later, although, of course, a good Hingepoint question probably has distractors in there that are based on misconceptions to see just how much of those misconceptions are still held by the students. So I hope that's useful. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And as you said, there's the misconceptions can still be there. It's constantly assessing and seeing if that is addressed.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got another question here from Sabine, who's had already asked a question, but I thought, Chris, that this would interest you, so I kept this one in, because Sabine, she's asking here about picking assessment for learning as an area for research, as doing a thesis and some data collection. So I thought that would go to the heart of what you believe in. So she asks, if she wishes to do assessment for learning, how can she make her data authentic? Should she go for a comparison between classes, experimental types, any rubrics that she can draw on? So I just thought it'd be a good chance for you to support somebody who's looking to research in this area.
You should be answering this one, Andrew. You're doing a PhD in assessment for learning at the moment. It depends on your research question, Sabine. So you need to think, what is your research question? What do I really want to find out about? And then you can then think about your methodology and look for bits to go with that. We've got a specialist group in the Association for Science Education that looks at research, and one of the things that they're doing a lot of at the moment is looking at helping teachers do action research. Mm-hmm. So it's well worth looking on the Assessment for Learning website. I know that the STEM Learning Centre here are running a research conference in, I think it's May, pretty sure it's May because I'm coming to speak at it. So that again would be a good place, and there's quite a lot of help for that now. What is important though is that you approach this very much from exploring ideas and finding out more rather than doing it as an evaluation. It's not to say, right, I'm going to try this strategy, does it work? Because you'll find out, yes, it does. Because always when we try new things, as long as we're thoughtful about it, you're going to get them to work in the short term. It might not help long-term learning. So, think of it very much as I'm going to find a question that explores ideas and finds out more. We never find out the whole truth in research. If we did, I'd be out of a job. But we do find out more. I've been working on assessment for learning now since 1993, and there's still a lot of questions that I need to explore. Found out a lot, but I need to explore more, and I need to find the right methodology and questions to do that. So you'll need to do the same. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and Sabine, as Chris says, I'm doing a PhD at the minute. It has taken a long time for me to actually refine the questions. And once you've refined, and I'm talking a couple of years, and then once you've refined the questions, and that was going in and out of classrooms and seeing what was happening, to then come up with the methodological approach that I've actually put in place as a consequence. As Chris says, it takes time, and it's really worth exploring the field and digging more around.
But that's not to say that it would take you that long, because Andrew's doing a PhD, which is pretty high level. But if you want to do action research in the classroom, then it is actually finding a question that's relevant to your context and that you actually want to work with. I was just, as Andrew was talking, there is a school in London that I've been working with who've actually done that with groups of teachers. If you are interested, Sabine, put something on the discussion board and I'll come back to you on that and tell you a bit about the sort of work they've been doing.
Okay, brilliant, really helpful. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sabine, and good luck with that. Good luck with it. Patricia Otsapa has got 3 questions here. I don't know if we'll answer all 3, Patricia, but we'll have a look. She's asked, in intentional dialogue, what type of questioning works best? Mm-hmm. And then the next question I thought was particularly useful for others as well. How long can you keep bouncing a question in a class when you've not got the desired answer? That was interesting.
Okay, so you need to make questions that actually encourage discussion and encourage thinking. That's what an intentional dialogue question is. So there's various ways of doing it. Some teachers are very good at using Bloom's taxonomy, so they ask an application or a synthesis or an analysis question rather than just a recall question. Others use solo, where they're getting children to sort of connect ideas together, etc., within the question. I tend to, and many of my teachers just tend to use the question stems that we've put into the MOOC. And one of my favourite ones is it always true that? Because then I make a statement and they can't just say yes or no, they have to justify their answers. So your second question is, how long do you keep bouncing it around? Well, I mean, one of my favourite techniques still is pose, pause, pounce, bounce. And I still use that a lot. And I found that usually by the time I've got up to 6 or 7 bounces, which is pretty good, quite often it's only 4 or 5, when I get up to 6 or 7 bounces, we might not have got the answer that I was hoping for, right? We might have got the correct answer, but my students will have said enough so that I can then pull it together and know how to move them forward. So in that particular case, that what the question is doing is really finding out where are they at, where are the students at. It's a bit more like a Hingepoint question in a way when it goes in that particular way, but it gives you that bouncing time. to actually think about how do I move them forward. But in the majority of cases, they do sort one another out. And the great thing is you get students listening to one another, which is not an easy thing to achieve in more traditional teaching. They tend to listen to the teacher or listen to, or not listen at all. So in that sort of context. So here we've got students listening to one another, and again, they're more likely to compare their answers with that of peers, and to think about the more nuanced type of answer that they're giving, and so sort out their ideas better in that sort of situation. So I think persevere. It's hard when you start with pouncing and bouncing. But persevere with that and let it bounce quite a few times so it gives you that time for teacher thinking.
Looking back at our questions, we have our next question coming up from Jennifer Kitching. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer asks, are there any strategies that we can use to encourage pupils with processing delays who often find it difficult to have the time to answer questions if they're asked quickly? I presume that's what Jennifer's asking.
I'm not a specialist in this particular area, but I think with all of these things, if students are finding it difficult to do whole class question answer or whole group question answer, what some teachers do is to do things that actually take away the stress of question answer and create discussion in other ways. So one particular strategy I've seen teachers use is to have what I call yes-no cards. So there might be 6, 8, 10 cards with either a term or maybe a sentence or a couple of words on about some part of the topic. And the kids have to just go through the cards first of all, maybe in a group of 3, saying, yes, I know something about this. No, I don't know anything about this. So they get 2 piles. The no cards they put aside. And then with the yes ones, they pick one card up and each takes it in turn to say one thing about that particular card they know something about. And it goes around the group. So they're creating the dialogue, but they're doing it sort of stepwise and then building it up. And that works very well. It works great for the teacher because you can go around listening in and picking up, what's the bits that they're really not so sure about, and what's the bits they've already got, and how do I take this forward. So it's a good assessment for learning strategy, and it takes that stress away when some children actually feel that they can't think when they're asked a question directly. They need a bit of time to do that.
Great, thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. Thank you, Jennifer, for asking the question. I've got a question here now from Jorgen van Moertier. Apologies, Jorgen, if I've got that wrong. He's asking about self-assessment with students who are at the age of 12 and 16. He's asking how reliable is it for the student themselves as a learner. He's saying that his students can often provide work for their peers, but they're not very good at internalising it for their own work. Any advice on self-assessment, particularly that age group?
Okay, I mean, we've not actually dealt with self-assessment in the assessment for learning in STEM subjects. It's just really questioning and dialogue. But obviously, as part of our work, we've done quite a lot of research on this. Yeah, self-assessment is really hard. One of the ways that we found that helps students develop those skills they need for self-assessment is to do good peer assessment. And good peer assessment only works if teachers model feedback well to start off with. So really you need to get your dialogue and your feedback to students, both oral and written, sorted out before you move on to doing a lot of a lot of peer assessment, a lot of self-assessment. And so students gradually build up their skills. One thing that helps is to get children to develop an understanding of what quality work is. So modelling answers, getting students to improve on either anonymous answers and then eventually onto one another's answers, and then eventually they start to do it for themselves because they start to recognise what they see in other people's work within their own work. It's very hard to be critical of yourself, especially if you put a lot of effort into it. So that gradual build-up will probably help. And 12 to 16-year-olds can do it very well. 4-year-olds can do it. But it takes time to actually develop the skills. I mean, with 4-year-olds, it's saying, what are you most proud of? All right. Gradually, if the teacher's actually saying they're proud of a piece of work because, or the TA's saying that, the student starts to learn that language and build it up. So if 4-year-olds can do it, you'll get 12 and 16-year-olds to do it eventually.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope that helps, Jorgen. So it's the idea that it's going to take time, but a structured approach that follows Chris's advice will really help. So thank you. Next, Chris, we've got a question from Paul Sinnott. He asks, how do you encourage students to persevere on hard problems?
Just tell them to keep going. I think if you say to them, you set them up for it and say, this is going to be challenging, but I know you can make a good go at this. So that they know they can get part way through. The other thing is to get them to, if it's a hard problem, to work on it in pairs or groups of 3. I know on our very first Assessment for Learning project, Karen, one of the maths teachers, got the students to do the most difficult questions from the SAT papers. That's a test that they used to give them at age 14 here in the UK. She just picked out the 5 most difficult questions and got the students to work on those 5 questions in pairs. And most of the students couldn't do those questions on their own, but they struggled through to an answer in a pair, and then they checked the answers against a mark scheme and were saying things to one another like, oh, I could have got this far. And so getting them to realise they can pick up marks, getting part way, and getting them to see that they can be helped to get the full way through peer support. It's very Vygotskian, those of you who are into Vygotsky and Zone of Proximal Development. That sort of approach can work really well. I think the other thing that you can do with students in terms of perseverance is get them, praise them for that. People praise kids for all sorts of things, but praising kids for, having a real go at a difficult homework or really trying to answer a question rather than giving up, that's the sort of things that we should praise for, and not just for getting things right. It's for actually the way they work on things.
Yeah, more of that classroom culture popping up.
Absolutely.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. Moving on to a question from Jennifer McClooney. Jennifer's asking here about when pupils have selected an answer to a Hingepoint question, is it suitable for a pupil who got it right to explain the correct answer to the rest of the class to help with misunderstandings?
You could do, but again, Hingepoints really are there for teacher use just to gauge what's going on in the class. They're not really meant to be a learning opportunity at that stage, but you might use them in other parts of the learning cycle, maybe during revision parts, or you might want to set things for a homework for students, give them a couple of Hingepoint questions that they've done, say, a few weeks before, and see whether you can do it, and if you can't, ring one another up, get them to be collaborative. I mean, they're always phoning one another, aren't they, on their mobile? So you might as well, or Skyping one another. You might as well let them do that and sort that out, rather than spend class time on that when, if they haven't got it, it's probably going to take quite a lot to get them to sort it out, more than just one student telling them the answer.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jennifer. Moving on to a question here from Nani Handayani, and I've seen this question several times actually, Nani, on the course dialogue. How many Hinge questions ideally should be asked in a class?
As many as you need, but usually only 1 or 2. And only in some classes. Hingepoint questions are not for every lesson. They're there when students have actually got to a point where you feel that they've grasped, or quite a lot of them have grasped a concept. So that's when they come up. They are to be used sparingly. So it is those challenging sorts of questions. It's not the simple type question that you would ask just to sort of engage pupils and just check that they are not asleep, that they're paying attention. It's not those sorts of questions. They are really challenging questions. Just use them sparingly. One, because that's their purpose, but secondly, they're hard to write. And I challenge anybody to write 10 Hingepoint questions. It would take me a good month or 2 with people's help to do that. So just use Hingepoint questions sparingly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nanny. I've got a question here from Nazish Junaid, who is working in early years. She asks, how can you make Hingepoint questions work effectively in an early years context?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a colleague, Sally Howard, who wrote Inside the Primary Black Box with me, who is much more gifted in this area than I am with early years work. I think it's, Hingepoint questions are about getting kids to decide on one thing or another. So maybe it's reducing the number of options that they can choose from, and so therefore thinking very, very carefully about maybe having 2 or 3 answers, to do that. But also getting them to sometimes sort of do things like really commit. So I saw a teacher doing this in a classroom with early years who was working actually on looking at the moon as a reflector and the sun as something that actually emits light. And what she did was get the kids she gave them all a pen and they went and had to tick on one particular board if they believed this, and another particular board if they believed that, and so on. And the kids did it really sensibly. I was quite amazed by how they did it, and really enjoyed doing it. And she then said, "Oh, this is really interesting. So, 16 of you believe this, and 3 of you believe that. And what that tells me is we need to work on this." So even with these young children, 5-year-olds, I think they were. Hingepoint questions were being used in a way that not only allowed the teacher to assess, but said to the children, this is what learning is about in the classroom. This is what I value. I value you telling me what you believe, because then I know how I can help you. I know how we can move your learning forward. So, it can work with early years. And early years specialists are the ones that know the best way to engage the learners in the learning. So I'm sure you've got lots of ideas on this yourself.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And a great idea there, Estrina, that you can go away and try if you've not. And again, let us know how you get on trying it out. It's always good for us to learn from each other. Moving on to Dinara Zia Denova. So we've got a question here. She's asked for the educator's opinion on the following. And I think this is something I've come across with several teachers in different contexts. How can group work be assessed with using formative assessment? What kind of evidence of student learning can be gathered when they're working in groups? I suppose she's thinking about the individuals in the groups and what that can tell us, or maybe whole group thinking. So what are your thoughts, Chris?
This is a huge one. I've got so many thoughts on this, mainly because I've got 2 big pan-European inquiry projects where we're working a lot on group work and how do you assess group work. I think the thing to say is that what you need to think about is not group work being problematic in terms of trying to get at how an individual's doing, but maybe thinking of it as a more authentic way of actually judging students' learning. Because in everyday life, in the world of work, we don't work individually, most of us. We work in teams, and so the part that they can play in a team is probably worth thinking about. And part of what you might want to do is to watch how some groups work and to look at how you can actually help them to be more honest in making the judgments themselves about how well they're doing in the group. So if you can get them to sort of say, not just that this is an answer, but the person who gave this idea to start off with, was Tariq, and then Emily built on that, and then Joanne added this. It's given you really rich data in terms of the sorts of answers that are there. So, treat group work as something where you just want to really help the learners to use one of the resource and sort things out. You can use it also to do, a quick sort of feel for how people are progressing. And then, use your Hingepoint questions to get at individuals. I think that's probably quite good. And then, obviously, when you collect students' work in, just assessing those artefacts will tell you how individuals are doing as well. So you've got lots of different ways of actually collecting evidence of learning of individuals and individuals working in groups. And then just when you have to report on that, just really sum that up in whatever way is best for your particular context.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. That's really helpful. We're nearly there. We've only got a couple of questions left. So I've got a question here from Christina Samadatsieva, who is asking, how can we distinguish between the two types of formative questions? Can they overlap? Can one question do both jobs? And this might be difficult, Chris, off the cuff, but can you think of a couple of examples? I'm sure we can refer people back to the course because there's lots of examples in there, but it's the questions more about the two types of questions and their purpose.
Yeah, well, the questions for intentional dialogue tend to be, as we've said before, very open type questions, although you might want to ask a question like, what's similar and what's different about something? And you could see how a question like that could easily be turned into a Hingepoint question because, the distractors so often could be similarities, some could be differences. So, you could link the two together a little bit, but I think what you're better doing is thinking about which is more suited to that particular point within the learning cycle. And diagnostic and open questions are probably better early on in the learning cycle, with your Hingepoint questions coming as they start to get really a little bit more secure in their understanding of that particular concept.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris.
Matthew Jones asks, how do you remember everything that people say as you question? My advice is just keep it simple. I would advise teachers just to look for two things when you listen to students' responses. One is which students are actually so confused that you're probably going to need to sit down with them and explain things one-to-one. And look also for what things can I actually do with a whole class to put things right. So you're going to miss an awful lot of information, but just remember the fact that you're getting these responses from students through these hinge questions means you're getting far more information and making your teaching far more responsive to the students' needs than will be the case with traditional teaching. Paul Martin's question is whether we have any ideas on making hinge questions, or any kind of assessment for that part, have a minimal effect on students with low self-esteem. I think one of the most useful techniques that I know of here is to ask hinge questions with multiple correct answers. So the idea is that a hinge question has at least one option which all students should be able to get correct. So the idea is that every student should be able to get a correct answer, but that the question also has more than one correct answer. And some correct answers might be so subtle that only high achievers will be able to spot those so subtle and sophisticated answers. So students who get one right answer will feel okay, and it's my experience that those students will not feel bad they didn't get all the right answers, but I think that your more able students might actually be paying more attention in future once they realize that they may have got one right answer that you put into the question, but they didn't spot the other ones. So I think that's a way of keeping students on their toes, as you might say. Sabine Kamar asks, have you, while devising questions, thought of or come across an idea that what you planned as a hinge question turned into a stimulating constructive dialogue? And the answer is yes, many times. Something starts as a set piece and you might pursue this as a really interesting diversion. The important point is that as teachers get more and more experienced, as teachers develop more and more good questions in their heads, then any moment in a lesson is potentially a hinge, and it's a stepping off point for some kind of diversion. The important thing, however, is to be clear about the original learning intentions and to see whether this diversion is actually going to take you towards the learning intention or is going to be a detour, sidetracking the teacher away from the important material. This is really important in the context of schools where teachers are expected to stick to the lesson plan. My own view is that one of the hallmarks of expert teachers is the willingness to ditch the lesson plan when it's clear that it's not going very well. So I think hinge questions are just one way of creating evidence that it gives teachers feedback about how a lesson is going. The decisions may be to actually say, we'll put this to one side, we're not going to do any more work on this, I need to go away and think through more clearly how to do this with this class. The idea is that the hinge questions provide the evidence. The conclusions the teacher draws from that evidence are potentially infinite. Tim Ward asks, does the use of a hinge point question hold back the very able in a mixed ability class? It depends on the design of the question is the answer to that. So for example, as I've said before, I really like hinge questions with multiple correct answers. One at a level that should be accessible to every student in the class, and others that are a bit more subtle, and maybe only the highest achievers will actually realize that they're correct as well. So I've often tried this with students, and then if a student who should have spotted that there was more than one correct answer doesn't do so, I might tell her there was a correct answer there that you missed. You can bet that the next time that such a question is asked, that student will be looking very carefully for possible alternative correct answers that maybe aren't as obvious as the one that you've put there for the whole class. Nikki Wilby's question is, how do you support new or inexperienced teachers in the use of these hinge questions? And my advice would be to keep it very simple. So to begin with, as student teachers plan lessons, I would say to them, just try to identify the hinge. Where do you think you want to stop and check the students are with you? And then ask them, what question are you going to set at this point? And make it a very simple, if they get it right, I'm going to move on. If they don't get it right, I'm going to go back and teach it in a different way. And maybe just plan one additional way of teaching it. So to make it a very simple go, no-go decision. As teachers get more experienced, they can actually look for more complicated branching paths, multiple paths of options, different kinds of activities to follow up. But to begin with, I would keep it as absolutely simple as possible. Just one question, halfway through the lesson, do you go forwards, do you go back? John Luff raises a very important point, which is how can teachers sustain focus on using these strategies in day-to-day planning and teaching? How long does it take to feel a sense of personal competence and of impact on the progress of learners? Well, I think it's a very slow process, to be quite honest. And one where, if you think you're ever going to arrive at the destination, I think you're probably deluding yourselves, because I don't think anybody I've ever met thinks they've ever cracked this. The important point is we should first of all take small steps. So, in your day-to-day planning and teaching, maybe just try to put in a good hinge question in one lesson per week. If once that becomes more straightforward, then maybe go for one per day. But then I would suggest that the emphasis should be on improving the quality of hinge questions rather than just making sure you've got a hinge question in every lesson. Because good hinge questions take time. We come back to them year after year. Mark Wilson's team at the University of California, Berkeley, they've been working on questions and changing the wording and finding out how they go. They've been working on the same items for over 15 years. And these items are continually improved, but there's no destination. There's no final point of, yes, we've got this question perfect now. The idea is that we constantly refine these questions, but we're always going to be improving them because there's no such thing as a perfect question. Alison Skelding's question raises the issue about how we can get better student responses to our feedback, especially with mixed ability and EAL students. And obviously, many students find responding to feedback very difficult. One of the key things, then, is to make it more structured. So, for example, we might make responding to feedback a task of choosing or selecting some ideas rather than necessarily writing an extended written response. So students might, for example, be told, 5 of these calculations are wrong, you find them, you fix them. The big idea here is making feedback into detective work, so students actually have to think and choose and select. EAL students, they might find it useful if there's other speakers of the same language in their classroom to discuss their responses orally in their mother tongues, and then think about how they might represent that in English. The important point is we structure these responses the response patterns to students so that it actually becomes less demanding on their linguistic abilities. Paul Thomas raises a question about terminology in science and mathematics. He quite correctly points out that you can ask a question one way and most of the students will get it correct, and yet if you tweak it very slightly, many will get confused. This is a really important insight. It shows that the learning is very much tied to the context of the learning, and if students can't tweak the answer a little bit, if they can't apply it even when a small detail is changed, it suggests that their understanding of this issue is very, very shallow. So Graham Nuttall has shown that getting students to be able to apply what they've understood in a slightly different context is crucial to long-term memory. So yes, students will get confused, but I think it's really important that we get students to apply what they've just learned in another context, because without that, the learning is far too tied to the actual context of the lesson in which they learned it for the first time. Ian Valence's question raises the thorny issue of acceleration versus enrichment. And this has been a very, very long-standing issue in mathematics and in science education. Some students find learning the classroom materials we want them to learn very, very easy, and others find it much more difficult. And so there's always a spread of achievement in any group of students. Estimates are that within a class of 12-year-olds, there'll be some students functioning at the level of the average 18-year-old and others functioning at the average level of a 6-year-old. So you've got a 12-year gap in achievement in a typical classroom in lower secondary school. And there's no clear answer about whether acceleration or enrichment is the best. It's often bound up with values. However, there does seem to be relatively clear evidence, even from the mathematics community, the university mathematicians, that enrichment is probably better than acceleration. Ian also raises the specific issue around something that is often called mastery learning. So the idea is that no one should move on until the whole class has mastered something. And it strikes me that that's a counsel of perfection. That'd be nice, but it's going to be very difficult to do that consistently. The important point is the teacher needs to make a professional decision about whether it's right to move on or whether the class needs to revisit this topic, and the teacher needs evidence to make that decision professionally. As long as you have good evidence, that how you interpret that is a different issue, but you need the evidence. Mark Coleman said he's struggling with the distinctions between assessment for, assessment as, and assessment of learning. You're not alone. Paul Black, Chris and I actually tend to use the term formative assessment far more than we use the term assessment for learning, because we don't think it actually helps. So this is what Jim Popham calls the prepositional permutation, and it's very easy to slip into an idea that assessment of learning is bad, assessment for learning is good. But I think it's really important to understand these labels aren't particularly helpful unless you're clear about their meanings. More recently, people have talked about assessment as learning, and as far as I can work out, this idea has come from writers in Canada, and what they've done is they've talked about assessment for learning as being mostly around the teacher's role, eliciting evidence and giving feedback, and assessment as learning concerning the student's role, both as self-assessors and assessors of each other. My own view is those terms aren't particularly helpful. Assessment is a procedure for drawing conclusions, and therefore I think the term assessment as learning isn't particularly helpful. As long as we are clear that assessments are about eliciting evidence, interpreting them to draw conclusions, then I think we won't go too far wrong. So sometimes the conclusions we draw are about how much of a particular set of materials a student has mastered. That would be a summative example. Sometimes we want to draw conclusions about what would maximize that student's learning in the future. That would be a formative example. So I think the important thing is I don't find assessment for, as, and of learning very helpful. I think the summative-formative distinction is helpful, provided we're clear. There's no such thing as a summative assessment or a formative assessment. Formative and summative are descriptions of the uses to which information from assessments is put. The same assessment can yield evidence that is used both summatively and formatively. Jennifer Kitching raises an important question about whether there are strategies to encourage pupils with processing delays to be involved in an open discussion. Often the trains of thought go too quickly, not giving them enough time to formulate or answer questions. This was very much an issue in the TV show The Classroom Experiment that I did with the BBC a few years ago. When we actually said the rule was no hands up, first of all, the high-achieving students said, I never knew my classmates were so smart. When teachers allow students who are confident to dominate the classroom discussion, the classroom is dominated by those who are confident and quick, not those with the most important or useful or interesting things to say. So, for example, I would routinely expect, after I've asked a hinge question, to give students time to discuss, to think, and maybe even give them 2 minutes to actually think about that before asking them to make a choice of an answer. That way, I think students with perhaps more profound but slower thinking styles won't feel that they're constantly playing catch-up. People often worry about pace, but the important thing is pace is not the same as speed. Pace in teaching is about ensuring that as much of the time as possible is spent minds on. And often that's done better by slowing things down than it is done by speeding things up. Jochen van Remortere asks, how reliable is self-assessment for students? I think there's an important issue about here, about whether even reliability is the right way of thinking about this. So the question is how meaningful, how valid self-assessments are for students. And there's no doubt that if we're just asking students to make judgments about how happy they are with their understanding, then those judgments are going to be influenced by the students' desire to feel that they're successful. So if the stakes are high, then self-assessments will be inaccurate. I think there's plenty of research to show that. So I think the really important thing is that we must in some way anchor the students' self-assessments so that they know what they're deciding. That's why just asking students, give yourselves a green, a yellow, or a red circle according to whether you are confident, less confident, or not at all confident, doesn't help very much. We often see boys giving themselves a green where a girl would give herself a yellow. But if we can say, for example, green means I'm now ready to teach this to somebody else, then that begins to give the students some idea of what it is they're meant to be signaling when they're signaling green. So in the longer term, we do see students' self-assessment abilities improving, especially when they're not high stakes. So I don't think that the students' own self-assessments should ever be factored into any kind of grade or report that's given to a parent, for example. For me, self-assessment is all about the formative purpose, not the summative purpose. Jennifer McClooney asks, when pupils have selected an answer to the question, is it suitable for a pupil who got the correct answer to explain the answer to the class? I think absolutely. It may be also useful to have several students helping groups who are still struggling. The important point is it's still the teacher's responsibility to look after the quality of learning. So before we get students explaining things to each other, we have to be very clear that they understand what kinds of things they should be saying, and the teacher needs to be eavesdropping on those conversations. It's easy to do if it's a whole class discussion, much harder to do if students are in smaller groups. But the important point, when students help each other, the teacher is still responsible for the quality of learning that takes place. Nani Handayani asks, how many Hingepoint questions should we ideally ask in class? Can a Hingepoint be used for a simple question, or can it be used only for assessing a student's understanding in a concept? Well, I would say it's whatever you want to find out. So sometimes you may want to find out that all the students can correctly apply a straightforward technique, in which case a hinge question will be entirely appropriate for that purpose. Sometimes you want to find out something much deeper, and in which case a hinge point will be appropriate for that too. The important thing is, if you want to find out, then hinge questions are a good way to do that. If it's important to you, it's worth doing. Edith Davis points out that some children find it very difficult to take part in group discussions, particularly because they're worried about getting things wrong. And I think that's where a teacher can make a real difference in creating a culture where students understand that being wrong is good, not bad. So as I mentioned in the classroom experiment, we encourage teachers to use no hands up. And some of the higher achieving students were quite surprised by how profound the contributions of the lower achieving students were. But what was even more interesting was the reaction of the higher achieving students to being picked on when they didn't know the answer. So the teacher's perception was that these students had their hands up all the time. They didn't. The higher achieving students had their hands up most of the time, but only when they were absolutely certain they knew the right answer. And when teachers started picking on students at random to answer, many times the students who were seen as being high achieving were actually getting things wrong. And this was tremendously powerful in terms of the cohesiveness of the class, because now everybody was getting things wrong. So the big idea here, this is based on Carol Dweck's work on mindset. We need students to understand that work that doesn't make them struggle isn't going to make them smarter. So I say to students, mistakes are evidence that the work I gave you is tough enough to make you smarter. If you're not making mistakes, the work I'm giving you is probably too easy, and I'll try to make it more difficult for you in the future. That's the kind of mindset we need from our students. And so I think particularly making sure that the high achievers are seen to be making mistakes, the idea that everybody makes mistakes because this is worthwhile and challenging work, that is a very powerful idea in helping low achievers see that it's okay to make mistakes. And if you're not making mistakes, this probably isn't worth your while.
Okay, so I thought it would be useful. I am amazed, as always, at the ability of Chris to think about the variety of experiences that she's got and draw on so many different ideas. But I thought we've had quite a few recurring themes coming out across the various questions that have been answered, so I thought it'd be good just to sum them up. Something that's come out really strongly, I think, from the discussion that we've had here is this idea about questions being used to assess concepts, and thinking about not the facts and the knowledge and the recall of the teaching that we're doing, but actually the concepts that those facts and information link to, and how we're assessing that and building that. Something else that Chris has talked about really strongly is learning as a cycle. And I think that's come out really, really well over lots of different people's questions, and then thinking about the questions we ask during that learning cycle and how it links to what we're wanting to identify in the learners, and then how we use the feedback in that cycle to respond to the evidence that we're getting and keep that learning going forward. We've also had the idea about connectiveness, about concepts linking and helping our learners understand more about the subject because we're starting to link those concepts and ideas. And a big thing that's come out is about classroom culture.
Yeah.
And the culture where it's about identifying learning and getting all students to feel that no matter what they're thinking, their ideas, they're all valid, they're all useful for us as educators to think about. So we've had lots of strategies, we've had this idea about purposeful planning, and then Chris has given some really good ideas about how we can actually manage that in classrooms where we have either in secondary high turnover of students, or in primary where we've got younger children, how we can actually get them engaged and how we can start grouping and organising groups and using learning and the learners to help support each other. So thank you, Chris. I don't know if you've got any other themes that have popped in your head, because I think you've been answering questions. I've been kind of distilling that out. If there's anything you want to add, but I'd like to say a big thank you to you.
Well, thank you. That's an amazing plenary, Andrew. That was really good. I couldn't have done it myself like that, so that's really good. Thank you.
It's because I'm researching at the minute and coding and thinking about people's responses. That's why it's very at the forefront. And a big thank you to Dylan as well, who I'm aware is not with us, but obviously it's the experience and the expertise that Dylan and Chris bring, and that research underpinning pedagogy that really helps us all move forward. So I'm sure that as this is on YouTube and you can access it for a long time, you'll find that you'll keep coming back to it and finding new things out. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.